Today's courtroom, which is typically filled with the hum of legal jargon and peaceful deliberation, suddenly became agitated as the judge prepared to pronounce the punishment, placing Kenneth Copeland, a well-liked TV personality and outspoken voice, in the heart of a shocking and unforgettable moment. The words that followed seemed to freeze the air with the severity of what was being stated, and as Copeland stood there, his countenance was a mixture of dread and expectation. In an instant, his look went from shock to something far more concerning than before. Anyone could comprehend the situation completely, but Kenneth Copeland collapsed in the middle of the courtroom, his legs giving way beneath him. What could have triggered such a visceral reaction, the sentence itself or something more intimate? The room fell silent in shock as people hurried. According to her, the situation is developing more quickly than anyone anticipated, and this sudden development has everyone wondering about the real cause of Copeland's downfall and the harsh reality that he now has to deal with accusations and a web of deceit. Kenneth Copeland was once a prominent figure in televangelism, and his fiery sermons, prosperity gospel doctrines, and lavish lifestyle have been examined for years, but nothing could have prepared his followers for what was about to happen. Faith-based broadcasting is currently embroiled in a scandal so huge that it has rocked the foundation of his ministry. Rumors of his financial misdeeds had been going about for years, but many people wrote them off as the work of sour critics who didn't like his success. However, federal agents had been quietly constructing a case behind the scenes that would ultimately place Copeland at the center of a courtroom with severe criminal charges against him. Federal prosecutors claimed that Copeland had planned one of the most complex financial schemes ever observed in religious broadcasting, and Copeland's enormous empire. It was alleged that Copeland had transferred tens of millions of dollars into personal accounts, buying lavish private jets, opulent homes, and even offshore assets, rather than using the millions of dollars and donations from loyal followers solely for the purpose of advancing the gospel. One of the most damning pieces of evidence that was concealed from tax authorities was an internal document that was leaked from Copeland Ministries. The document purportedly described a plan to reclassify personal expenses as ministry costs in order to evade scrutiny. This document, along with testimonies from former employees, became a major focus in the prosecution against him. As the trial went on, former associates, financial officers, and even longtime ministry members testified, disclosing startling information about the inner workings of Copeland's empire. Some even claimed that Copeland had personally ordered financial records too. Perhaps the most startling testimony came from a former senior accountant who described how millions of dollars in donations were transferred into offshore accounts. Others talked about threats and intimidation tactics used to silence staff members who questioned where the money was going. "I was told unequivocally that questioning Kenneth Copeland was like questioning him," the former employee said in court, "and when you work under that kind of fear, you don't ask questions, you just follow orders." This was done to ensure that the IRS and federal regulators could never trace the money. Investigators discovered evidence indicating that members of Copeland's inner circle had engaged in coercion and exploitation, luring followers into special treatment, just when it appeared that the case could not get much worse for Copeland. These allegations went beyond financial fraud. These revelations transformed what had started out as a white-collar criminal case into something much more sinister. A spiritual manipulation program that preyed on the sick, the desperate, and the faithful, persuading them to make financial commitments under the pretense of divine command. Empty their bank accounts in the name of divine prosperity. With the evidence against him growing, Copeland's empire was now in danger of collapsing, and his formerly devoted followers were split, unable to make peace with the man they had trusted. Copeland, who was known for his unshakable confidence, became clearly frightened by the mounting avalanche of accusations as the judge was ready to render his decision. Then, in a moment that no one could have foreseen, the courtroom was in the midst of one of the most explosive and well-publicized trials in recent history. Kenneth Copeland, once one of the most influential televangelists in the world, was thrown into chaos and sent to prison. The courtroom was silent for a rare moment. For years, Copeland had built an empire on the promise that faith could bring wealth and success, and his face, which was normally straight with the confidence of a man who had spent decades preaching about divine favor and prosperity, was now marked by tension and something else, fear. The judge was ready to read the verdict. Assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His ministry, which was well known for its lavish displays of private jets, expansive estates, and personal wealth, had been under inspection repeatedly, but this time the accusations had escalated to the point where the government was no longer in control. Kenneth Copeland, this court finds you guilty of fraud, tax evasion, and the misappropriation of charitable funds. You have used the name of God to defraud thousands of people by exploiting them. The judge's voice seemed to weigh down the entire room as he finally spoke. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, sending a wave of gasps and whispers through the courtroom. Copeland's knees buckled, his hands, which had once held golden microphones and 1,000 pens, trembled as he gripped their faith for personal gain for these crimes. You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The edge of the table, then abruptly he fell, causing reporters to panic and cameras to flash wildly. Security guards hurried to his side, and his lawyers, who were clearly shaken, attempted to hide him from view. The man who had preached prosperity for Kenneth Copeland's fall from grace was years in the making, and although rumors of financial wrongdoing had trailed him for decades, it wasn't until a former ministry accountant came forward with incriminating proof that the entire extent of his. Copeland personally oversaw the diversion of millions of dollars in donations intended to help suffering families, fund missions, and grow his religious programming, according to court documents that exposed misconduct. One of the most startling discoveries was the usage of faith pledges, which encouraged desperate followers to give everything they owned with the assurance that God would restore it to them tenfold. These pledges were used to buy luxurious homes, sports vehicles, and even finance hidden offshore accounts. In the belief that they were planting a seed into God's kingdom, many people maxed out their credit cards, remortgaged their homes, and spent all of their money. However, the prosecution's evidence revealed that the seed had only grown into luxury for one man, Copeland, and subsequent inquiry revealed a Copeland-only private airfield with a fleet of private jets registered under different shell corporations connected to his ministry. Part of the funds even went toward opulent trips, shopping sprees, and exclusive club membership costs that were passed off as religious outreach programs. One former employee who had worked closely with Copeland's financial team testified in court regarding the televangelist's tactics. I was reminded that questioning the man of God was the same as questioning God himself, and I was told not to ask questions if money disappeared. To oppose him, since doing so would result in termination and exclusion from the industry. The proof was indisputable, and soon even Copeland's most devoted supporters started to turn against him. The prosecution's case was strengthened by numerous insider testimonies, including those of his former personal pilot. When Copeland entered the stand, the courtroom became silent as he stared at his old mentor in the eye. One of the most surprising betrayals came from his own right-hand man, a senior pastor inside the organization who had been by his side for more than 20 years. He included his accountant and even veteran members of his ministry staff. The eyes and said, "I trusted you, we all did, we thought we were doing God's work, but all along you were robbing people of their hard-earned money while standing behind a pulpit telling them they had to give more. I can't live with that, the truth has to come out." Copeland's expression remained grim. A widow described how she had donated her husband's entire life insurance payout after he passed away from cancer. Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from the very people he claimed to serve, the families who lost everything because they trusted in his promises. She then discovered that her donation had been used to buy a multi-million-dollar estate in a gated enclave, despite her initial belief that Copeland's ministry would utilize the funds to spread God's word. "I believed in him and his message, and now I have nothing." She spoke while crying, and it became evident to everyone in the courtroom that there was no turning back from this. The change from luxury to incarceration was swift and brutal. The silk suits, private planes, and unending fan devotion were gone, and Copeland now wore a prison jumpsuit. Reports from inside the prison indicated that Copeland struggled with the reality of his new environment, with daily life dictated by the strict structure of the federal penitentiary system. Guards observed that he still carried himself like a preacher, frequently trying to give impromptu sermons to fellow inmates. However, this time, nobody was paying attention to someone who had spent decades in charge of every part of his life. Being just another prisoner was a degrading fall from grace, and even after his sentence, Copeland attempted to keep up the appearance that he was still in charge by giving his. The ministry had to sell assets to pay for legal bills, and his once loyal followers started looking for spiritual guidance. The remaining ministry members continued to broadcast old sermons as if nothing had changed, but the truth was impossible to conceal. Just when it appeared that things couldn't get any worse, the IRS opened its own investigation to recover millions of dollars in unpaid taxes and concealed assets. Agents searched through decades' worth of financial documents and discovered shell corporations, offshore accounts, and hidden trusts. In a final attempt to preserve what was left of Copeland's fortune, he tried to move money to a private account in the Cayman Islands, but federal investigators stopped the transaction before it could be completed. The corporations were all created to shield Copeland's fortune from investigation. Once heralded as one of the most influential televangelists in contemporary history, Kenneth Copeland's name was now synonymous with scandal, avarice, and demise. Even his last allies abandoned him after recognizing that doing so would only bring them down. Deceit, his story turned into a warning about how unbridled wealth and power can corrupt even those who profess to serve God. His church shut down, his empire was destroyed, and his once loyal and unshakable followers were left behind. Kenneth Copeland, stripped of the life he had built on deceit, was sitting alone in his prison cell, questioning everything they had ever believed. He finally faced the truth. The prosperity gospel had promised him everything, but in the end, it had taken everything away. Why have you said that you won't fly? You claimed in the commercial that it would be like entering a tube with a group of devils. Why do you think that I should not listen to you? It's only a second course, not the people. The primary issue is that if I flew commercial, I would have to. Isn't it true that you want to fly commercially so that you can travel in luxury? For instance, how much did you spend on Tyler Perry's Gulfstream jet? That's really none of your business, but isn't it the business of your donors? That's about 65% of what I'm doing. Listen, I paid you, which sort of threw me off guard. All right, well, if you want to come out here, I'd want to give you a chance to collect your breath and talk to you. We don't want to surprise you. I love Inside Edition, you must have this right away. Hey, you're listening to me. My wife believes that Inside Edition is great. Thank you, Lord, for allowing me to pray. Now, let me ask you a very basic question. Many people believe that it is unworthy of a preacher to lead a lavish lifestyle and travel in private aircraft. What do you think? Responded to that straightforward statement, it costs a lot of money to do what we do. Kenneth Copeland's fall from grace. In the weeks after his conviction, the outside world changed, but behind the chilly confines of M.C. Carswell Federal Prison, Copeland remained. The televangelist, who was formerly regarded as an untouchable prophet of riches, was confronted with a reality he had never envisioned for himself. He was now a fallen giant who had lost his fortune, prestige, and the adoration of millions of people who had once thought he was a direct conduit to God's gifts. Copeland initially refused to accept the seriousness of his demise. He continued to project the same air of authority while preaching to other prisoners in an effort to regain the sense of control he once had over thousands of people, but there was no pulpit here, no bright studio lights, and no jubilant congregation. His first attempt at giving an impromptu sermon ended badly, as inmates laughed, ridiculed, and some even heckled him outright. The prison yard was no mega-church, and the men he now ate meals with had little patience for a man who once sold salvation for a price. It became painfully obvious that in this setting, his words had no weight for a man accustomed to controlling the narrative. One of them, Pastor, mocked the opulent lifestyle he once displayed while telling struggling families to plant their financial seed. Jared, on the other hand, made reference to it. As Copeland struggled to adapt to life behind bars, the outside world began to break away the remnants of his empire, which the ministry formerly prized. He retreated into silence, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact in an attempt to navigate the unknown seas of his new existence. Without Copeland in charge, hundreds of millions of dollars were in financial ruin, donors stopped supporting him, television stations stopped airing his shows, and the once loyal group that had protected him for decades started to disintegrate under legal pressure as the IRS investigation became more covert. Under false pretenses, the government seized several properties, including the mansion Copeland had designated as his prayer retreat, which turned out to be an opulent vacation home complete with hidden real estate holdings, offshore trusts, and millions of dollars. As revelations of his financial corruption continued to come to light, many of his former fans felt deceived on a very personal level, with gold-plated bathroom fittings and a wine vendor selling bottles that cost more than many of his followers earned in a year. Congregants who had formerly drained their wallets to sow seeds into God's kingdom, only to discover too late that they had only funded Copeland's lavish lifestyle. One woman, who had given her final $500 to Copeland's ministry in the hopes of receiving a divine financial breakthrough, sobbed as she told a reporter, "I believed in him." Stories like hers were all over the news and social media, transforming Copeland from a well-respected preacher into a national disgrace. The last straw was when we believed that if we simply contributed in faith, God would bless us, but all we did was make him wealthy, and now I can't even afford my rent. Copeland's closest relatives started to turn against him. For years, Copeland's family had supported him publicly, but once the truth of his crimes became unavoidable, rifts started to appear within his inner circle. His son-in-law, who had served as one of the first to come forward in a candid interview, was the ministry's financial advisor, who acknowledged that he had personally seen fraud occur but had been too scared to speak up. "I saw things that didn't sit well with me, the way the money was handled, which was always about keeping it within the." One by one, former employees, financial managers, and even close family members came forward to distance themselves from the man they formerly referred to as their leader, Copeland's own daughter, who had been strongly involved in the family's efforts to maintain the ideal image and to accuse anyone of questioning anything. Her words sent shockwaves through the remaining followers of ministry, who issued a statement expressing deep regret for ever defending him. "I wanted to believe my father was a man of God, but now I see he was just a man, a deeply flawed one, and I cannot in good conscience stand by him anymore," she said. Gloria Copeland, his wife, who had stood by him for decades preaching the same prosperity gospel message, was the last public betrayer of Copeland's ministry. Since his trial, she had avoided interviews and refused to speak out, so how could anyone else defend him if even his own daughter could no longer do so? To make public declarations, but 3 months after he was sentenced to prison, she filed for divorce. The announcement was harsh and quick, claiming only that she wanted to distance herself from her former behavior and concentrate on her own spiritual path to Copeland. It was the final embarrassment. The woman who had supported him on international television shows was now removing him from her life. Copeland was now all alone, his days were jumbled together, and his ministry was dissolved. Cry from the lavish lifestyle he had before being given special treatment, his meals were the same as everyone else's, his room was a frigid cell. And his days were spent performing menial prison work. At one point, he tried to file an appeal, arguing that he had been unfairly singled out, but the court quickly dismissed it. His request was ignored by the convict, who saw him as simply another scammer who had been exposed. He was reduced to a ghost, a forgotten artifact of a scandal that had blazed too brilliantly and collapsed too soon. He hardly talked, spending the most of his time in silent reflection, but whether it was. No one could say whether it was sincere introspection or simply resentment over his fate, but as the years went by, his health deteriorated, the stress, the humiliation, and the loss of everything he had worked so hard to build. In his last month, he experienced a series of strokes that left him weak and hardly able to speak. By the time he was transferred to the jail medical unit, his once dominant presence had diminished to that of a weak, elderly man who was unrecognizable from the televangelist who had stood before millions of people proclaiming his divine favor. One morning, Kenneth Copeland was discovered unconscious in his cell. In a brief statement to the media, jail officials verified that he had died of natural causes, but the world had already moved on and his death was hardly more than a footnote in the scandal. Previously dominating the news, the empire he established was long gone. He had stolen wealth, and his legacy was now stained beyond. For years, he had pledged his redemption. Followers that they would receive from faith wealth, but ultimately it had abandoned his with just remorse and an empty jail cell.